I, for one, thank you. And I mean, God bless you is about the only thing that I think is appropriate, because you're right. Something is very, very wrong with that model. I've had people come up to me at a conference. One old man who came up to me crying and said, "My wife is in the audience. If she finds out what you just talked about, that I'm the person, the victim." I talked about this on stage in Canada, and he was hysterically crying and said, I'm going to lose. She's going to leave me. This is all we have. The stuff that I have seen, you can't even make up. And I'm trying to be honest about this as I can without divulging names or anything like that. But I went on a whole series of shows and started talking about this because I want people to know that it is as bad or far worse than what Dale is leading onto. Dale, you had mentioned off air that when you left, you were somewhere around $40 million that the company had done at 30+% markups. Is that right?
It's way worse than that, actually. So we scaled. So I was the second in the door. There was another gentleman that was there before me. His name was Jeffrey Ward. So I think, if you don't mind, I'll start from the very beginning. So Isaac Nuriani, the CEO of Augusta Precious Metals, worked for a company called Merit Financial. Merit Financial were sued by the city of Santa Monica, city of Santa Monica, for fraud, deceptive sales practice, and so on. And in fact, Isaac was named in one of the lawsuits against Merit Financial, and then he was subsequently dropped because he was under the corporation, and so on and so on. So some legalese there, but that was what it was. So when that happened, Isaac actually left the company during this time and started Augusta Precious Metals with his savings that he'd accumulated from being one of the top salesmen at Merit. Now, Merit Financial were doing like $200 million a year, so they were big time. They were doing a large amounts of revenue with the same exact model. Now, Isaac started Augusta Precious Metals, and he wanted to start scaling, so he started hiring off of Craigslist. Essentially, he hired a guy named Jeffrey Ward, who was subsequently sued for $76 million by in a joint lawsuit from the CFTC and the SEC with a company called Red Rock Secured and a guy named Shay Johnson Kelly. I have pictures of myself with these guys at my wedding. I know these guys, right? Like, I worked with them side by side. They were at my wedding. And so the corruption has been ongoing. I mean, this lawsuit was filed in 2012, and it was brought to a conclusion in 2014 when Merit had to shut their doors. So Isaac had started, he brought on Jeff, and then he brought on myself. And then when Merit Financial closed, Shade Johnson Kelly, who later started Red Rock Secure and was sued into the ground, showed up on Isaac's door because he worked a couple of blocks from Merit's HQ. The guys showed up to Merit. There was a notice on the door that said, "Hey, we're closed. See you later. Good luck." The guys went over to Augusta with Merit's leads in hand. They stole the lead database, and they went to Augusta and said, "Hey, man, we don't have a job. Are you ready to go with Augusta?" Because they knew, like, he was good friends with Shade Johnson Kelly, so they knew that he was starting Augusta. And Isaac just converted his living room into basically a boiler room sales floor. And they took the Merit leads and they start cold calling leads, and it kind of blew up from there. So we went from doing, like maybe a few $100,000 in 2014 to in 2016, 17 doing like $45 million in gross revenue with about a 15 to 20% net profit margin, which, as you know, in the precious metal space, that net profit margin just does not exist.
5 or 6 times what we make.
Yep.
At 15%, we'll do $700 or $800 million in sales. That's the only way you stay in business, is to be competitive at 2%. 2.5%, it would be great if you can get it after all the expenses and shipping that you pay for. And it's 1% or less typically. I'm sorry, keep going, please.
Yeah. So no, you're fine, and you're exactly right. And I think that contrast is really important. Now, I was not in the precious metal space before this. I was a freelance accountant at the time. I was picking up gig work, and I was doing I'd take a client's full year stuff, and I'd sit down, and over an 8-hour period, I'd crank out financial statements. That was kind of my gig at the time. And so the way that I happened upon Augusta was just through doing gig work. Then I got offered a full-time position there, which I subsequently took. And there were some things, I guess, over the years where, red flags, hindsight 2020, things that when put together cumulatively make it so obvious that this was happening. But because I was here in Washington State and the headquarters were down there, I didn't really get direct access to the sales floor. I didn't see the dynamic of the sales floor and how the salesmen closed sales, how the salesmen interacted with customers, and so on. And the way that they do this is a lot of it's fear mongering. A lot of it is honestly just brute force. And they kind of use what I call the car dealership method. If anyone's ever bought a new car and you go to a car dealership and they keep you there all day, right? And they kind of break you down over time and try and sell you these packages and all this other thing. They kind of do the same thing where a client will be on the phone and they'll start building rapport with them. And sales can take days instead of just being like, hey, I want to buy gold American Eagles. And, here we are and we're done, right? Out the door. Very simple. Well, they don't do that. They start building a relationship and building trust with clients so that later on they can exploit that trust. And so over time, as I've seen these things in kind of in a vacuum, and then the realization hits that they're manipulating the spread, which is where the real fraud happens. I realized, oh crap, these guys really are taking people's retirements en masse.
So one of the things that you've said so far is what I had assumed, and it puts that puzzle piece firmly in place. When I've been talking about this on other shows, Sarah Westall, Kyle Seraphan, both shows you've been on, Beyond Mystic, talked about it with Adam Taggart, Robert Kiyosaki, all sorts of people. We've talked about this. And what you said to me is very interesting, that merit ceased to exist and it filtered down to Red Rock and to Augusta. When I'm on these shows, I say something without mentioning names. And the interesting thing is that every single one of these companies, and there's a few you haven't mentioned yet, they all do the same thing. They all do the same thing, and that is they sell quarter-ounce gold coins at typically, like between 1,000. Well, now that it's I was saying this when it was 2,000 an ounce, but it's, they'll sell it at huge spreads above, but they're always quarter-ounce gold coins from mints that you've heard of, but the design you've never heard of. They're coins you've never heard of, like a quarter-ounce grizzly bear from the Royal Canadian Mint. Well, they don't make a quarter-ounce grizzly bear unless it's a special edition. They call it a special edition, in other words. So what I'm assuming these companies do is they go to the Royal Canadian Mint or to the Perth Mint or to the Mint in the UK, and they will strike a deal to buy a mold or create a die, make their own coins that they have exclusivity to, and then they call it special or whatnot. And the same thing is true with silver, always somewhere between half ounce and 1.5 ounce at massive premiums. So what I'm getting at is that you have 5 or 6 companies and they all do the same thing. Every one of them.
It's more than 5 or 6. There's a lot. And there's actually even ones that pop up and I am like, who are these guys, right? And so what's really important to understand is that this dichotomy of this Augusta being birthed from merit and then Red Rock being birthed from Augusta, this happens all the time. This is consistently what happens because the salesmen that are smart enough to understand that the money isn't in the sales, the money is in owning the company, will create their little cliques as sales teams. You know how this works, right? Sales teams have like kind of cliques, people they prefer. They build these cliques and they go, hey, why are we selling for this guy and making this guy a multimillionaire when we can just go start our own company and we can be the multimillionaires? That's exactly, greed is what fuels this whole thing. I mean, Shade Johnson Kelly was making $650,000 as the vice president of Augusta, working 30 hours a week. That's more than doctor money. He would otherwise be flipping burgers at McDonald's. He has no other credentialing. He has nothing. He's a smart guy. I don't think necessarily education makes you smart. He's a smart guy. But the reality is he has no other background in anything other than sales. So, but what salesman makes $650,000 a year, right? It was ludicrous money.
And I want people to understand, from my perspective, this is flat out white collar crime. One of the reasons that I left Miles Franklin in Minnesota. I live in Delray Beach. My office is in Boca. The reason I moved to Florida, um, or the reason when I moved to Florida, that I left my corporate office in Minnesota. We've had a satellite office down here in Florida for almost 20 years. And I left Minnesota during the George Floyd riots and came down here. The reason I didn't bring my company with me is that Minnesota is the only state in America that regulates what is a federally non-regulated industry. And so we are held to a much higher standard. Most of companies, including all of those, would never do business in Minnesota. They would have to be licensed, bonded, and background checked every year. But I want people to understand that what these people are doing is flat out white collar crime.